So we are going to move on to peripheral and autonomic nervous system and look a little bit at reflexes. Hopefully now things will kind of fall into place, because a little bit of what we are going to say, or maybe even a lot of it, is repetition of what we did, in the brain and spinal cord and, the general nervous tissue. So, kind of try and recall all of that. So let's look at the peripheral nervous system. So this consists of everything outside the central nervous system. If you remember, central nervous system was the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system are the cranial and spinal nerves. But associated with the cranial and spinal nerves, we have ganglia, we have receptors and motor endings. So those also are part of the peripheral nervous system. And this peripheral nervous system, if you remember, was the way that the brain and spinal cord, remember, those were like the headquarters, the corporate offices. That's how they communicated with the outside, with the environment. They either got information from the outside or they sent information to the outside. When I say outside, it is to the body wall, right? So they got the body wall interacted with the environment. For example, when somebody pricked you or something, that information went to the central nervous system, and then it processed that and told you you've been pricked, right? And then when you removed your hand from that area where you got pricked, that was because that brain and spinal cord, they kind of send the information out, but they had to use something to send the information to the muscles. So they used this peripheral nervous system, which went again to the muscles. They stimulated the appropriate muscle and you took your hand away, right? So you can see how they allow a to and fro communication between the world around us. If you remember, when we were doing the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system consisted of a sensory or afferent and a motor or efferent, which is what I just told you. Any information going to the central nervous system was called sensory. Any information going away from the central nervous system was called motor or efferent. And you can see how it is carried to the central nervous system. Look at the sensory division. It takes the impulses through the peripheral nervous system, which then takes it to the CNS. The CNS brings the information out to the peripheral, and then the peripheral takes from here, right, to go to the muscles or glands. And if you remember, the motor division had two parts to it. There was a somatic, which was supplying skeletal muscle. So this is really a review of what we did last when we first started. So somatic was skeletal muscle. And autonomic was cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Cardiac, smooth, or glands. And autonomic is further divided into a sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay? So this time we are going to do all of this. So we'll be discussing sensory impulses, we'll be discussing motor impulses, we'll be discussing that in the somatic part of the nervous system and also in the autonomic part of the nervous system. Okay? Yes? Now let's first begin with the sensory part. In order for sensation to actually go to the central nervous system, it has to begin somewhere, right? Where it begins, the structure which kind of receives the stimulus, that structure is known as a receptor. So the receptor is something that responds to a stimulus. It could be part of a nerve. When I say part of a nerve, for example, here, look at this nerve, the axon. After all, nerves are nothing but collection of axons. Remember, we were talking about flowers and stems. So if we drew a bunch of flowers like this, these were the nerve cell bodies, right? And collectively, you could call them gray matter, cortex, nucleus, right? And we'll introduce another word you could use is ganglion. Remember these stems, they could be called white matter, or another word we could use is tracts, or they could also be called a nerve, right? So a nerve, at the end of the nerve, you remember the axon had those axon terminals at a synapse, right? But when all that synapse is over and done with, but when this nerve is actually beginning from the skin, these little rounded ends of the nerve itself may act as a receptor, or it may be a special separate cell, such as in the eye, for example, in the retina of an eye, you actually have a separate cell, like you have two separate cells called rods and cones. Rods are helpful in looking at something in dim light, and cones are for color vision and bright light. So they are separate cells, or it could be like these ends of nerve fibers. And I gave you an example of a separate cell. In the case of muscle also, you have this separate kind of a cell which is known as a muscle spindle. So these are all receptors, okay? What do? Receptors, they respond to a stimulus, and that's how they are able to take it to the central nervous system. So what they do is they take it to the brain and spinal cord. I've just put brain, where the awareness of the stimulus and the perception. Awareness is knowing that something is going wrong, that some stimulus has come, and perception is how you feel that how do you feel that stimulus has bothered you. And I have an example in your notes. For example, if you prick yourself with a thorn, for example, right? The awareness of that pain that you are aware of when you're pricked by a thorn, that is the awareness. And the perception is it's caused you discomfort, right? So if it causes you a lot of discomfort, then you react to it and you pull your hand away. If it's not much perception is, it's a little bit of discomfort, you may not even react to it. So the perception is what determines our reaction, right? The awareness is being aware that you've been poked or touched or pricked, and your book gives you an example, like imagine if you have a pebble in your shoe, and that, when you put your foot into your shoe, you feel that pebble, that touch, that's the awareness. And again, you feel discomfort, that's the perception. And if it's really bad, you kick your shoe off, right? Okay? Now, some examples of sensory receptors. One is, like I said, rods and cones. Others are free nerve endings, like these are actually free nerve endings. When we did the integumentary system, you remember Merkel's disc, which was a touch receptor seen in the epidermis. Here are some muscle spindles, which are seen inside muscle. Inside the ligaments and joints, we have something known and tendons, we have something known as Golgi tendon organs. These are all examples of receptors. And receptors may also be classified based on what kind of sensation they react to. For example, any receptor which would react to stretch or touch or pressure, it's like a mechanical stimulus, so we'll call it a mechanoreceptor, right? So mechanoreceptors would respond to touch, pressure, stretch. Okay? Nociceptors come from the word noxious. Noxious means painful. So nociceptors are one which respond to pain. So these free nerve endings are nociceptors, or nociceptors as they are called sometimes. Then inside, when we were doing sensation, we always think of, whenever we think of muscle, we always think of motor only, because, we think all that a muscle does is it contracts. But again, when we were doing the brain, I also told you, you have information which goes from the muscle to the brain, and that's sensory impulses. This is telling you what the tension is inside a muscle, or what the position is of a joint, okay? Such kind of impulses which go from muscles and joints and ligaments to the brain, sensory information, this is known as proprioception. That kind of sensory information going from muscles, joints and ligaments to the brain is known as proprioception. So those receptors are called proprioceptors, and muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs which are present inside these areas are proprioceptors.
What type of movement would it take, like moving your arm up?
Yes, it tells the brain of body movements. For example, you do not overreach for anything normally, right? You do not flex beyond what is needed. So it gives the brain the information that you've reached your goal, And, and it, of course, I'm putting it really simply, it also involves the cerebellum in this case. Cerebellum, you saw how it coordinated muscle activity because it receives impulses and it further sends the impulses to the cerebral cortex. So that's how all of this, like you don't overshoot when you need to get anything, okay?
So is that like spatial awareness?
Spatial awareness is a little different. This is, in this case, I'm talking about muscle position and joint. Then we have chemoreceptors, which obviously respond to chemicals. And, like for example, there may be different types of chemicals, when you eat or drink, your chemoreceptors, like pH of a solution, when you do the digestive tract in ANP2, you'll see how when the chyme or the food which is in the stomach, it's called chyme, when it's kind of broken down, it's acidic. And when it gets into the duodenum, that acidic pH kind of sets off chemoreceptors which begin to secrete something. Sometimes alkaline pH will do something. Similarly, in your respiratory system, when your pH can change if you breathe too rapidly or you don't breathe rapidly. I mean, you kind of have very shallow breath. Again, your blood pH changes and chemoreceptors detect that and they can kind of react to it, okay? Thermoreceptors are obviously for temperature. So, these are special receptors which will respond to hot or cold. So, this is temperature. And photoreceptors are for light. For example, your rods and cones are a good example for light. Photoreceptors, okay? So, based on what they are reacting to, we call them, the name is quite simple. So, think of this. Drinking orange juice, which is acidic, would primarily stimulate which kind of receptor? Less noise. Chemoreceptors, excellent, yeah, you got that. Now let's look. So we said that, okay, you sort of poked something or you touched something hot. Now, how does all that information actually go to the brain and how do you actually become aware of that information and how do you what is the perception? So this, basically, don't stress too much about this. This is really to put your minds at rest. I don't want any gaps in your knowledge. You know that there's a sensory response. It's going towards the central nervous system. How does it go to the central nervous system is basically what's happening here. So what happens is that, let's say at a free nerve ending, so it's showing you pain, because sometimes very hot or very cold can also cause pain. So free nerve endings can also feel temperature or muscle spindle, any kind of receptor. So here it's showing you something like with a joint. So, let's say, so that's a proprioceptor. So the impulses from this area, they receive the stimulus, which is taken, and what they do is it gets into the spinal cord. So these are sensory impulses. It gets into the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it actually travels all the way up the brainstem. Remember those ascending tracks we talked about? So you can see these would all form tracks, which are, because they're going up, we would call them ascending tracks. And here's how you'll remember, ascending tracks therefore would be sensory because they are going towards the central nervous system. And what they do is they go to an area which actually is there might be some sort of synapse at a point called reticular formation, but most of the time they go to an area called the thalamus. If you remember when we were doing the thalamus, we said the thalamus was the sensory relay station. That was one function of the thalamus. So sensory relay station was the function of the thalamus. So this first neuron goes and synapses at the thalamus. Some of these impulses may go to the cerebellum. So you can see how they're peeling off and going off to the cerebellum, as I just told you. Like when your joint is moved, the impulses would go to the cerebellum. From there, they may go to the thalamus and then to the brain. So that's how it helps to coordinate all that. So you can see the same thing. So you can see most of these impulses going to the thalamus. Some going off to the cerebellum, from where, you can see they go to the thalamus and then they go to the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe of the brain. If you remember again, the parietal lobe of the brain was the sensory area. So here we can see the second neuron. So this was the first neuron. The second neuron from here goes to the parietal lobe. And actually the first neuron, really, they haven't shown it up here. It really synapses in the spinal cord. So you might get confused. So let's put a synapse here, but it really synapses in the spinal cord. And then the second neuron travels up here. So it goes to the thalamus, and from the thalamus you can see a third neuron will go to the sensory cortex. So that's how this long way that the ascending tracts actually reach the sensory cortex. It isn't as if one single nerve fiber will travel all the way uninterrupted right up to there. It has to kind of make little gaps, stay where it's kind of like to pay a toll. So there are little toll stations on the way, right? So there's one toll station usually in the spinal cord or the medulla. The second one is the thalamus, and then it finally reaches that. So this is how it kind of goes to the sensory area of the brain, where you become aware of what you felt, and then there's your perception. Is it causing discomfort? Do I have to react to it? Or no, it's not causing discomfort, so I can kind of let it alone, right? Okay, so this is what is meant by sensory integration. In other words, how is it going to the brain, and how is the brain finally perceiving it? Now let's say it caused discomfort, which would be felt by the sensory cortex. The sensory cortex would then send an impulse to the motor cortex, which would actually send a fiber all the way down, and this will go to the spinal cord, and the motor fiber would come out and go to the muscle, which would contract. If you didn't feel anything, then the whole thing will stop short here. You understand how this whole loop is formed, okay? So now we were talking about, how these impulses travel. These impulses travel by way of nerves. And nerves are nothing but a collection of axons. And again, to kind of review, if I remember, I gave you an example of, if you think of a neuron as a flower, and these are the little dendrites, and the stem is the axon. So if we have a collection of these flower heads, all of these together, the nerve, what we call the nerve cell bodies, remember the flower heads were called nerve cell bodies, we kind of made them equivalent. What names could we give them? Cortex. What was the other name that we could give this collection of nerve cell bodies? Nucleus, very good. Ganglion, excellent. Ganglion is outside the CNS. These two would be inside the central nervous system. Anything else? Gray matter, yes. Gray matter, right? This collection of these stems, which is all the axons, we call this white matter. What was the other word? Tracts, very good. And we also call them nerves, right? Okay? So now I'm talking about just a group of axons, so which I'm going to call nerves. So I'm talking about a structure of a nerve. So I'm really talking about these axons. If you remember muscular system, this is very similar to the muscular system. Remember, in the muscular system, this was the whole muscle. The muscle was covered by epimysium, if you remember. Then the muscle had little fascicles. These fascicles, each fascicle was covered by perimysium, right? Peri meaning going around. And inside each fascicle, you actually had muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber was nothing but a muscle cell. Each muscle fiber was individually covered by endomysium. Do you remember that? Okay? Same thing here, we just changed the name. So think of the whole nerve, this entire nerve, to be like the muscle. So it is covered by, instead of mysium, because mysium had to do with muscle, in the nerve it would be neurium. So this is covered by epineurium. So the entire nerve is covered by epineurium. It in turn is made up of fascicles or bundles of axons. So these fascicles are covered by perineurium. So notice that one fascicle has been drawn out. It's covered by perineurium. And each fascicle is actually made up of a bunch of axons. And each axon is covered individually by endoneurium. So see, very similar. So it was E on the outside, endo on the inside, and the peri in between. Simple, okay? Now let's look at classification of nerves, and we'll also talk about ganglia. And again, this is just a review. When we classified neurons, remember we said there were sensory neurons. And we talked about motor neurons, right? Sensory neurons were called afferent neurons, and they carry impulses towards the central nervous system. Motor neurons were known as efferent neurons, and they carried impulses away from the central nervous system. Therefore, nerves, which are just a collection of axons, the classification is the same. Sensory nerve would be a nerve which had a bunch of axons of sensory neurons. Motor nerve would be a nerve which had a bunch of axons of motor neurons, okay? So, we'll say a sensory nerve is one when it contains axons that just carry impulses to the central nervous system, because by definition, sensory means going towards the central nervous system, right? Going towards the central nervous system. Motor nerve would be one which contains axons which convey impulses from CNS to muscle and glands. Because remember, a motor neuron was one which supplied a muscle or a gland, right? So here we are just using a nerve instead of neuron, because neuron was single, nerve is got many of those. A mixed nerve would be one when it has both sensory or motor, right? Mixed would be where you have both sensory and motor traveling together, like a highway, where you have traffic going north and traffic going south. Now, as a general rule, all spinal nerves are mixed. That means they contain both sensory axons in them and motor axons. So there's kind of traffic going north and south in them. Cranial nerves, however, are different. They may be mixed, some of them are mixed, some are only sensory, and some are only motor. And let me give you an example of cranial nerves and you might understand. You know, when you did the skeletal system, you talked of a canal called the optic canal. You all definitely remember that, right? And you know that the optic nerve passes through that optic canal. Optic is to do with eye. Eye is what kind of thing? When you look at something, that sensation is that of vision, right? So when you see lights, or you look at some color, that vision is carried by the optic nerve and it goes to the brain. And the brain understands, okay, I saw a red colored thing, or I saw bright light, or this was dim light. That's all the optic nerve does. It just carries information to the CNS. So what kind of nerve would it be? Sensory, right? Hypoglossal nerve. This nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve, we'll do the nerves later. The hypoglossal nerve supplies the muscles of the tongue, and it allows you to protrude your tongue, allows you to pull your tongue back, allows you to roll your tongue like that. That's all it does. What kind of nerve would it be? Motor. Okay. Let's look at the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th cranial nerve. The trigeminal carries sensations from all of your face area. So sensations from your face. If I was to pinch your face, all of the sensations from your face would go from here. Ugly man, but it's okay. From here, the sensation would go all the way up to your brain, right? So this is sensation. Also, remember we had muscles of mastication, 2 of them you should remember, temporalis and masseter. The trigeminal also actually comes and supplies these 2 muscles. And they are muscles of mastication. They help you chew. There are 2 more muscles, the pterygoids, but anyway. So what kind of nerve would the trigeminal be? Mixed, right? So you can see that the cranial could be mixed, sensory or motor. All spinal nerves, as you'll soon see, are always mixed. And you'll see a reason why, okay? Then let's look at ganglia. Remember, ganglia were, again, a term which we used for collection of these flower heads, right? This part, that was the term we used. So it was collection of nerve cell bodies. So they contain nerve cell bodies. Ganglia is the term we use when these nerve cell bodies are outside the central nervous system. When these nerve cell bodies are within the central nervous system, we called it gray matter or cortex or nucleus. You all saw that in relation to the brain, the spinal cord, right? We saw cortex and gray matter and even the nucleus. Remember those basal ganglia, they was inside the brain. So in the CNS. But when you look at ganglia, these are outside the CNS. When they are associated, you will find ganglia associated mainly with sensory neurons. And when sensory neurons are pseudo-unipolar neurons, if you remember if you go back and look at the first nervous system lecture when we described multipolar neurons were present in the central nervous system. Bipolar neurons were all in your sense organs. And pseudo-unipolar neurons were present in sensory ganglia, which means these outside the central nervous system. And one very good example is what is called the dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal root ganglion. And if you remember, sensory ganglia, pseudo-unipolar was where the cell body it gives off one axon and then that axon divides like this. So it's like an unusual flower. So it's a flower which has one stem and the stem kind of bifurcates like that. Okay, so that's pseudo-unipolar and see how they draw it here. So you notice they show the cell body, then one small stick and then that divides into two ways. So one is this one is this one. Can you see that? Okay. So pseudo-unipolar neurons are associated with sensory ganglia and they are seen outside the nervous system. Outside the central nervous system. When we do the autonomic ganglia, I will repeat this again, there are some ganglia which are associated only with the autonomic nervous system. Those ganglia have efferent neurons or what are called motor neurons. And these are actually multipolar. So when we do these, we will talk about them again. But for now, concentrate on this part, which I'm talking about, the sensory ganglia and the pseudo-unipolar, because that's what I'm going to show you. Now in this picture, I want you to, again, this is a review, because when we did the spinal cord, we talked about this. So if you remember in the spinal cord, when you take a section of the spinal cord, you notice a fissure both in the ventral part and a sulcus in the dorsal part, right? They're both really grooves. Look at the H-shaped gray matter present in the center, right? The white matter is peripheral, okay? And we saw the white matter was kind of divided into three columns, one posterior, one lateral, one anterior. This is where tracts were present. You saw all those tracts, the stems going up and down. And in the gray matter, remember this was like a little horn at the back called the dorsal horn. This area was called the ventral horn. And in certain parts of the spinal cord, which we'll see when we do the autonomic nervous system, we have a little horn on the side, which is called the lateral horn. This is only seen in the thoracic and the sacral segments of the spinal cord, right? We also saw when we were doing the spinal nerves, we also saw that the spinal nerve, this part here is called the spinal nerve. It is attached to the spinal cord. So can you see the spinal nerve just doesn't come straight out. If you look at this picture, it doesn't show the spinal nerve coming out like this, like a single sort of thick stem. Instead, the spinal nerve actually is attached to the spinal cord by, you can see, two prongs, right? These prongs are known as the dorsal root and the ventral root. So these are like roots. It's like this is what kind of, you know, how roots attach the tree to the underground, the soil. So similarly, the spinal nerve is attached to the spinal cord by two prongs which are called roots. The one at the back is called dorsal root. The one in front is called ventral root. Also notice that the roots are called sensory and motor, right? Dorsal being called sensory, ventral being called motor. I also want you to see just from this picture, this is why it's so important to look at these pictures. If you look at these pictures, in the dorsal root, what kind of neurons are passing? Sensory. Can you see the dorsal root is only carrying sensory impulses? Can you see that? What kind of impulses or neurons are passing in the ventral root? Motor, right? So, and what kind of neurons or axons or impulses are in the nerve? Spinal nerve. Mixed, both, right? So can you see how we can say spinal nerves are therefore mixed? Can you see that? The nerve is actually mixed. This nerve is like a highway. Imagine the nerve is like a highway. And then at some point in the highway, you have traffic going north and traffic coming south. Okay, so very similar. So you have sensory and motor. But at some point in the highway, let's say you need to take exits. You have sometimes, the exit for the north is one way and the exit for the south is one way. So that people who need to travel north go through one exit, people traveling south go through another exit. Think of these routes like exits. Okay, so all sensory impulses will travel only through the dorsal root, and all motor impulses will only come out through the ventral root, so that the impulses at this point are kind of separated. They're not joined together. Okay, so roots are either sensory or motor, whereas the nerve itself is mixed. Have you noticed? Okay. Also notice this dorsal root ganglion. What is it attached to? The dorsal or the ventral root? Dorsal root, right? Can you see it is attached to the dorsal root just before the spinal nerve is actually formed? Okay. Yeah, I said the dorsal root ganglion, which is this one. It is attached, can you see, to this dorsal root just before this nerve is formed. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about cranial nerves. We will come back to the spinal nerves, but I wanted you to kind of show you how to look at that picture. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves numbered from 1 to 12, and you must know both the Roman numerals and the names of those nerves. Okay, your lab book has a very good way to remembering them. I mean, I know them. I don't have a mnemonic good enough for you, so just make up your own or use the lab book. It has a pretty good mnemonic that you can use. Okay, the first two pairs arise from the cerebrum. But the remaining, so the majority arise from the brainstem. Remember the third, when we were doing the brainstem, we said like how the third and the fourth came from the midbrain, the fifth to the eighth from the pons, and then the ninth to the 12th from the medulla. So you can see the third to the 12th come from the brainstem, but the first and second are from the cerebrum. These cranial nerves may be, which we are repeating, they may be sensory, like optic is sensory, the olfactory is sensory. They may be motor. I gave you an example. Hypoglossal is motor. There's another nerve called oculomotor, that is motor. Trochlear is motor. Those are motor nerves, and mixed, like trigeminal was one example, facial is another example, vagus is another example. So these are all mixed. Okay, you don't have to know which one is mixed, which is sensory, which is motor. I'd much rather have you know their functions rather than waste your neuron space trying to remember which is more mixed. Okay. Now, if you look at these nerves, you can see that you start from the top. So we have olfactory. The nerves are actually present in your nose, and they come and relay in this little area called the olfactory bulb. The nerves actually pass through the cribriform plate. So we can't really see the nerves. You only see where they come in synapse. This is the second cranial nerve, the optic. Oculomotor third. This is part of the midbrain, this area. This is the fourth, called trochlear. So you can see this third and fourth from the midbrain. This is fifth, trigeminal. Sixth, abducens. Seventh, which is called facial, and eighth next to it, which is vestibulocochlear. So that's how they come out from the pons, the fifth to the eighth. Then 9th, 10th, 11th. So glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory, and then hypoglossal. So 9th to 12th, they come out from the medulla. Okay? So these names you must remember. You must remember whether it's your question could say third cranial nerve, or the question could say oculomotor. So you kind of have to remember both. So looking at this picture fairly frequently will kind of help you remember that. These are the functions of the cranial nerves. This is something that you have to know. So these are all the functions. I'm not going to go through these functions because I would just be reading them out. So instead, what I'm going to do is that you will notice when we do the autonomic nervous system, it is associated with a part of it, the parasympathetic, is associated with certain cranial nerves. So that's why you will see that in some parts I've written it's got a parasympathetic component like the third. And then we'll see the 7th, 9th, and 10th. So all of this kind of this is a quick review of the cranial nerves. But what I tried to do was use this to kind of give you a quick overview. Okay, so how to remember functions of the cranial nerves. Won't kind of do all of it, but most of the cranial nerves, if you look at this kind of chart, it helps. So let's start like this. So if we draw a person's face, the neck, okay? I'm going to have to bring the tongue out, okay? So let's see. So let's start in the midline. So we'll begin with number 1. So, you see how I'm going from here, okay? So we start with number 1. So let me use a different color maybe. So 1. Right in the midline, right? For smell. Okay? 1 is for smell. From here you go to the sides. You look at something. Number 2, optic, for vision. So what you might want to do in your charts is write down the name of the first, olfactory. Second, optic. And that will kind of help you remember. Okay? Now, not only do you see, number 2, optic is helping you to just distinguish that there is light or there isn't any light, or there is color or there is no color. Okay? But you all know that you can actually move your eyeballs, right? You can look up, down, right, left, towards when you hear sound, or towards smell or something else. So these muscles of the eyeball, the movements of the muscles of the eyeball, this is done, as you can see, after 1, 2, we get 3. So there's 4. Logically 5 should follow, but 5 is doing something else, so we then have 6. Okay? So for the eyeball movement, so eye is moving to the sides, so I'm drawing it like this. Okay? So we have 3rd, 4th, and 6th. Now we can't leave out 5th, big nerve, right? So we have to come back to 5th. So 5th then takes all your sensory impulses from the face, and it also supplies muscles of mastication. That's how you said it was a mixed nerve, right? So here we've got 5th. So you can see we've covered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then let's look at 7. Now muscles of mastication was on only one set of muscles, but you have so many other muscles on your face. The muscles which help you to smile and grimace and frown and do all of that. Those are muscles of facial expression. So that is 7. So we'll say facial expression. Well, I'm just going to put 7 like that, okay? So here muscles of facial expression. Here we've got 7. Now here we did, if you notice here I'm talking about sensations. This part of the chart is to do with sensations. So 7 not only supplies muscles of facial expression, it also carries taste sensation. Okay, so that's how I put 7 up here. But along with 7, it's 9 and 10 also carry taste. So when we do special senses, we'll be repeating this. But so here's a good time to kind of remember that taste is not carried by one nerve only. It's carried by 3 nerves. And we'll be repeating this again, but then you can always come back to the chart after this, okay? So we went with 7. So here I did 7. Next I've got to come to 8, right? So here we have the ears. So we forgot to draw the ears here. So 8 is to do with hearing and equilibrium. 8 is to do with hearing and equilibrium. Then after 8 we go to the 9th, 10th. So We've taken care of the muscles of mastication, we've taken care of muscles of facial expression, so now we've got to go down to the pharynx, the throat, right? Pharynx and larynx. So that is supplied by muscles, by the 9th and 10th cranial nerves. So here I'm going to write 9th and 10th cranial nerves. So muscles of pharynx and larynx, the 10th supplies both, 9th only supplies pharynx. And 9th and 10th also carry taste. And then you saw these two big muscles, the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. You remember those two muscles? We did that in the muscular system. Those muscles are supplied by this 11th cranial nerve, which is called accessory. So I'm going to draw sternocleidomastoid like this. And trapezius is this big muscle on the side this way, okay? So that is supplied by the 11th. And finally, after having done all of this, we stick our tongues out, and that's the 12th. Okay? So this is kind of, I thought, the easiest way I could kind of explain to you on how to remember which nerve supplies what. Otherwise, it's a long list. So use this chart, keep coming back to this chart, go to that other, all those cranial nerves in those other slides and come back to this and kind of see, add little things to this. But this is on a broad view. You can see a lot is given up here, okay? Now some other functions. So I'm going to erase this. Some of these you'll notice when you look at the list, some of these nerves are, we saw it, some had to do with taste also apart from everything else, so we put that. But some of these nerves are to do with glandular secretion, like, from your salivary glands, from your you cry, or you sort of salivate when you think of a juicy steak, or your gastric juices, you smell something good, your gastric juices begin to get secreted. So these are to do with, or your pupils constrict or dilate. So these are to do with smooth muscle. So these have what are called the parasympathetic component. So when we do the autonomic nervous system, we'll be repeating this. But just as an introductory part, you remember autonomic nervous system supplied smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Now they also have to use the peripheral nervous system to get to their paths. Now the peripheral nervous system consisted of cranial and spinal nerves and everything else which was outside, right? So what they do is they hop on to these cranial nerves and they go out, and that's how they reach. Because you remember, the cranial nerves are the ones which come to the face, isn't it? The cranial nerves come from the brain, they get to the face. So if if the parasympathetic nervous system has to go to the lacrimal gland, or it has to go to a salivary gland, or the parasympathetic has to go to the constrictor pupillae, the muscle, smooth muscle which constricts your pupil, it will automatically go with cranial nerves which are close to these various structures, right? So it uses those. So you can see that the nerves which have parasympathetic components in them are third, which goes to sphincter pupillae. So another action of third is not only moving the muscles of the eyeball, but also supplying sphincter pupillae through the parasympathetic component. The 7th, which helps you to salivate and lacrimate. The 9th, which supplies one salivary gland. And the 10th, as you can see, which does so much. It goes to your heart, and it goes to the respiratory system, the gastrointestinal system, and the genitourinary system. Okay? So this is a really good chart. So right now you'll remember some, but you keep coming back to it, read all what is given in your notes and the previous two slides, and then come back and it'll make sense. And when we finish the autonomic, this is going to make a lot more sense at that time.
The sphincter pupillae,
that sphincter means constricts your pupil.
So it's your eye dilating, or?
No, not constricting your pupil. Your pupil constricts. The pupil is the round part, the colored part of your eye is the iris. The pupil is that. So constrict is a function of the parasympathetic. Dilating, we'll see when we do the autonomic, that is a function of sympathetic.
Okay.
Okay. So that was on cranial nerves. Okay, so a lot of it is kind of understanding, finding some way to look at it. So that's why I kind of drew that picture and made that slide for you. So make little flashcards and kind of slowly, maybe draw a part, like when you're doing olfactory, draw a nose, and then that way you'll remember. When you're doing optic draw the eye and, just say color and make a colored eye. So you can say vision. And when you're doing the third, fourth, and, show the eyes kind of looking right, left, up, or something like that, okay? Now we'll move on to the spinal nerves. We did a little bit when we did the spinal cord. I also showed you a few slides ago a little bit about the spinal nerves, so we're going to kind of review that. First is, let's see how many spinal nerves there are. So we had 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Let's look at spinal nerves. How many vertebrae are there? Can anyone tell me a number?
32, 33.
33 vertebrae, yes. 33 vertebrae, okay? If you remember, the vertebrae was 7 cervical. So in the cervical region, you had 7 vertebrae. In the thoracic, you had 12. In the lumbar, you had 12. In the sacral, you had 12. And in the coccygeal, you had 4. So that makes it 33. How? It's not 33? Oh, what am I doing? Sorry, 5 words. No. Oh,
5.
sorry. Yeah, you're right.
7, 12, 5, 4.
Yeah. Sorry. So cervical was 7, thoracic was 12. Yes, sorry. Lumbar was 5, sacral was 5, and coccygeal was 4. Yeah, I meant to write 5. I don't know why I wrote 12. Okay, so that's 33. So I made a really long person. Yeah, so now if you think of it, the coccyx in us, it's a really small thing. It's got 4 really tiny vertebrae, right? All fused to each other. So with the result, it really doesn't serve any purpose. It's not going anywhere. So what we do is, for the spinal nerves, we don't have 4 coccygeal. We take out 3. We only have 1 coccygeal nerve, if you think about it. Cervical region is rather important. Remember, there was that cervical enlargement that we saw in the spinal cord because it had to go and supply the muscles of the upper limb. So the cervical region becoming more important, we added 1 to the cervical area. So we have 8 cervical nerves, though we only have 7 vertebrae. And we have 1 coccygeal nerve, though we have 4 vertebrae. All else remains the same. Now, how would you remember? To me, it's easy, but let me think of a way to kind of help you out. So let's say the first 2 should add up to 20, and the next 3 should add up to 11. Okay? So remember, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral remain the same. So thoracic, there are 12. It's an important region. There are 12 vertebrae, 12 ribs. You see no reason to play around with that. So you have 12 thoracic spinal nerves. So if you have to make between thoracic and cervical, if you have to make it up to 20, remember that cervical will be 8. Okay? Same way, the lumbar and sacral regions are important. The number of spinal nerves and the number of vertebrae remain the same. And now to add the coccygeal to it, all 3 should add up to 11. So if these 2 add up to 10, then this one can only be 1. Okay? So that's how you're going to remember. Okay? So you add 1 on top and you remove 3 from the bottom. Then, how are these spinal nerves attached to the spinal cord? We just saw that in that previous slide that we looked at. Remember, they are attached by 2 roots, the dorsal root and the ventral root. So here you have the dorsal root and the ventral root. And actually, if you look at it, the roots actually kind of become rootlets. Can you see the roots further divide and become little rootlets? You don't have to worry too much about it. It's just that the root, instead of going straight to the cord, it just kind of breaks up into little smaller parts which are known as rootlets. So here's the dorsal root, here's the ventral root. The dorsal root is sensory, remember, so it has sensory fibers which are axons of those pseudo-unipolar neurons of the dorsal root ganglion. DRG stands for dorsal root ganglion. Remember that dorsal root ganglion up here, that was the pseudo-unipolar cell, and this is how it was, okay? The ventral root, remember, it had motor fibers, and these are axons of multipolar cells which begin in the ventral horn, or in the autonomic nervous system, they would be the lateral horn of the spinal gray matter. So I'm going to go back to that previous slide. So I'm going to read this out again. The ventral root consists of motor fibers. We know that, right? We said the ventral root had motor fibers. But where do these fibers actually begin? They are axons of multipolar cells which begin in the ventral horn or lateral horn, if it was autonomic, of the spinal gray matter. So in other words, if I drew it here, they would begin from this ventral horn up here and then come out this way, okay? So I'm going to go back to that previous slide which showed this really well. Here. So can you see this was the dorsal root? It carried sensory neurons and their cell bodies, can you see, are pseudo-unipolar in the dorsal root ganglion. Look at these ventral root carrying motor fibers, but where are they beginning? They are from this is the anterior horn. Here is that multipolar cell. Remember, multipolar neurons were present in the central nervous system. So can you see the multipolar neuron is in the gray matter and in this ventral horn of the gray matter. In the thoracic and sacral segments, this lateral horn would be there. So from here also we'll see later that the autonomic fibers also will travel out along with these. But now I'm not going to draw that. So can you see these multipolar neurons? So their axons are passing out and they become the motor fibers. And where are they? In the ventral root. Have you followed this? Okay. So that's exactly what this is saying. So ventral root carries motor fibers which are axons of multipolar neurons which begin in that ventral horn or lateral horn when we talk of autonomic nervous system. Also you saw in that picture and in this one, the two roots join to form the spinal nerve. That nerve is mixed, right? And that nerve exits the intervertebral foramen. So look at it here. This is where the nerve would exit, in the intervertebral foramen. It comes out through the intervertebral foramen. All spinal nerves are mixed, unlike cranial nerves, right? Okay, so this part is clear. What kind of fibers in the ventral root? Motor. Where do the cell bodies begin? In the ventral horn. What kind of neurons are they? Multipolar, right? What about the dorsal root? What kind of neurons? Sensory. Where is the cell body of those neurons? Dorsal root ganglion. And what kind of neurons are they? Pseudo-unipolar. Okay. Now let's see. So we said that this spinal nerve it came out from the intervertebral foramen. So imagine if I was to draw a person. So here are all your vertebrae. And here's your spinal nerve which has come out, right? It had these two roots which went in, and this is the nerve which comes out, okay? So it has to travel a little, so it's way inside. So this nerve, when it comes out, it has to supply the front of your body. It also has to go and supply the back of your body as well, right? As it comes out, isn't it? So imagine if I just take a section from this area. So imagine this is the vertebra. Here is, say, the sternum, and this is your skin, the body wall. Okay, and let me say the spinal nerve comes out here, and then the spinal nerve has to go and supply the back also. It has to go and supply the front also, right? So we cannot have this one nerve coming into the front, then retracing its course and going back like that. Instead, can you see how I drew it? It went back this way. It's kind of like divided. It's almost like, imagine if you had a highway, and then which had kind of both things going south and north, and then you wanted some part of the highway to go south and some part of the highway to go north. What did you do? You split the highway, right? You made one part go south and one part go north. The same thing happens with these spinal nerves. So spinal nerves are really extremely short segments. So they're really just this part. Then because this nerve has to go to the back of the body and, carry impulses from there and supply muscles from that to that area, plus it also has to come around the front and supply muscles and skin in the front of the body, what the nerve decides to do is, what if I just split myself? I just split into two ways. One sort of branch will go to the back, one branch will go to the front. They will be exactly identical to me. So this part will go and supply the skin and muscles of the back. This part will go and supply skin and muscles of the front. And so I'm good to go, right? These little branches which come off this spinal nerve, these branches are known as rami or ramus is singular. So the part which goes to the back is called the dorsal ramus. The part which comes to the front is called ventral ramus. And you notice the word mixed because they're exactly like the nerve. It's just the nerve has been spliced. So it's same things which are going in the nerve will go in the rami. Okay?
If it was a sensory nerve, it would be a sensory nerve. If it's a motor nerve, it would be a motor.
No, in this case, it's a spinal nerve. Remember, all spinal nerves are mixed. So there's nothing like sensory or motor only. It's mixed. Can you see up here? It's mixed. So it's carrying both types of fibers. Can you see these sensory fibers are shown in blue, going through the dorsal horn, cell body here, and going into the central nervous system. Motor fibers begin from this gray matter, come out in the ventral root, and then come here. So the nerve is mixed. Notice that? And can you see that then the rami are also mixed? Because rami are just the nerve which has been spliced. Because they have to go to receptors of the back and they have to go to skeletal muscle of the back. These have to go to the receptors of the front and the skeletal muscles of the front. Okay? So rami are exactly like the nerves. The roots are different. The roots carry either sensory or motor. Have you followed? So this is what it says. Spinal nerve soon after its exit divides into a dorsal and ventral ramus to supply the posterior and anterolateral parts of the body. Anterolateral meaning the sides and the front of the body. The roots are medial to the spinal nerve. So see, this is spinal nerve. So can you see that the roots are medial to the nerve? Right? This is the spinal nerve. The roots are medial to the nerve because the roots go into the vertebral canal and are either sensory or motor. The rami are like spinal nerves, so are mixed, and they are lateral to the nerve because the rami occur after the nerve, right? So when the nerve splits. Followed that? So let's review this. How are spinal nerves connected to the spinal cord? And this is a good question to make you read it carefully. And here's one tip I'll give you. Whenever you see two answers which look very similar, always read the answers carefully. There must be something wrong with both answers. I mean, okay, occasionally I can make a mistake and give you the same answer, but most of the time I kind of catch myself. So see, there must be something different about them. So always look for the two. Either they're both wrong or one of them is correct. Come on, I want some more responses. Okay, the correct answer is by dorsal or afferent and ventral or efferent. And here's why. So this was the correct answer. This one. It is connected by dorsal roots and ventral roots, but dorsal is not called efferent. Remember, dorsal was called afferent because it was going towards the central nervous system. Ventral was called efferent because it was coming away from the central nervous system. That's why that's wrong. It's not connected by rami. Remember, rami are outside, the nerve splits. This was the correct answer. it's not, you don't see any ventral ganglia. You see dorsal ganglia, but there are no ventral ganglia. So if you look at that picture, so let me show you this picture here. See, there are no ventral ganglia. There's only one swelling on the back, the dorsal ganglia. There are no ventral ganglia here. Okay, so that automatically is wrong. So you really should have struggled with these two. Okay, so this is the correct answer because it says dorsal and ventral roots, but it also puts the other name of the roots correctly, which is dorsal or afferent and ventral or efferent. Okay. Okay, cell bodies of motor neurons, where do they lie? I mean, I should have elaborated ventral horn of gray matter and dorsal horn of gray matter. So look at that picture in your slide and look at the image and the labeling in your slide, and this should tell you. Ventral horn, yes, the cell bodies of motor neurons lie in the ventral horn, not the dorsal horn, not the dorsal root ganglion. And again, when we draw the spinal cord, so remember when we draw the spinal cord this way, and here's the gray matter. This is the dorsal horn, this here, and this is the ventral horn. If you remember, here were the two roots. This was the dorsal root ganglion. This was the ventral root which joined it. They formed the spinal nerve which divided into the two rami. Sensory neuron, whether it went from the back, let's say you scratched your back, impulses will travel through the dorsal ramus, go into the spinal nerve. It will have its cell body here in the dorsal root ganglion, pseudo-unipolar, and then it will go here. So this was sensory. If you scratch the front of your body, here it will do the same thing. See, it will travel through the ramus, but here it has to go through the dorsal root since this was a sensory root and go in here. If, however, you had to react to that scratch, and let's say you had to use a muscle to scratch your body, it would come from here, the motor neuron, through the ventral root. And if you were to do this, if it was to the front, it will go here. If something to do with the back, it will go to the back like this. So therefore, you can see both the nerve and the rami are mixed. The roots are either sensory or motor. Notice where the cell body of the sensory neuron is in the dorsal root ganglion. Cell bodies of motor neurons are in the ventral horn. Okay? Okay. Is this true or false? Sensory fibers enter through the dorsal root and motor fibers exit through, I should read through the ventral root. There should be an R there. So after drawing that image, I want 100% on this. I'd be very disappointed if I don't. True, yes, true. I didn't get the 100, but okay. Yes, sensory fibers enter through the dorsal root, motor fibers exit through the ventral root. So draw, I really suggest you draw. Use different colors because that will kind of really help you. Okay, here's another one to see if you've understood. Suppose you cut the ventral root of a spinal nerve. Say you were a neurosurgeon and you went in and you just were able to cut the ventral roots of a spinal nerve. What do you think would happen? So this is really critical thinking. Think what that root carries, you automatically lose that function. So I really asked this question, is very similar to the one asked before, but just worded it differently. Okay. Yes, when you cut the when you cut the ventral root, which carries motor impulses, then you damage, the muscles will not get their supply. So muscle supplied by that nerve will not function. It won't be loss of sensation of both, loss of sensation and motor activity, because you're only cutting the root, not the ramus. So if we go back to, this was where I drew it. Here. So here what I'm saying is that you cut this root. So this is fine. The sensations are able to go normally up here, but I'm only cutting here. So from here the fibers will start, but they can't go anywhere because there's a gap over here. So only muscles will be affected. If I cut the dorsal root, then sensations can't be perceived, but muscles will be okay. However, if I cut a ramus, then both will go, right? Or if I cut a nerve, then both will go. So again, I just worded everything differently just so that you know what the roots, what sensations travel to or away from the central nervous system and through which route, okay?
So is it possible for just one half of the ramus to be affected?
Meaning just the dorsal ramus to be affected? Yeah, theoretically, yes, it's possible. Theoretically, it's possible. Yes, if only the dorsal ramus is cut, maybe say you burnt yourself at the back, the dorsal ramus could be damaged until regeneration occurs. The front would still, you'd feel sensation. So yeah. Or, sometimes you have surgery on the back and you lose sensation for a while. So if back or front or wherever, you lose sensation only in those areas, everything else is functioning. So it is possible. Okay, here, again, a review on the spinal nerves. Which of the following is correct with regards to spinal nerves? In other words, I'm asking you about the distribution of spinal nerves.
I'm good at remembering numbers, but nothing else.
What's that?
I said I'm good at remembering things with numbers.
Okay, very good. Yes, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, they make 20, and 5, 5 and 1 make 11. Okay, so this is the correct answer. Here's what shows you that spinal nerve. So you can see why I said it was important for the nerve to actually divide. So if you look at the nerve, so it has these two roots. This is the nerve coming out of the intervertebral canal. And notice how it has to go to the back and it has to go to the front. So it says that it's easier for me if I just split into two. One part goes to the back, one part goes to the front. And that's why you have the ramus, the dorsal ramus, and you have the ventral ramus, and you have the spinal nerve. Okay, so this shows you really well. In certain parts of the body, what happens, especially in the limbs, muscles tend to develop from little bits of tissue called mesoderm. So when the tissue is developing, so let's say you all did pectoralis major, right? In primitive muscles, when they kind of develop from all of these joined together and form pectoralis major. Each piece of mesoderm actually had its own nerve supply. So now these muscle will get 3 nerves supplying it. Do you see that? Now let's say there was another muscle developing from close by another 2 bits of maybe 2.5. And this was developing like this. So now can you see, let's say we call this muscle pectoralis minor. Now this would be supplied by nerve from here, it's nerve like this. So it would get 3 nerves. So if everything went like this, all the muscles that you did in the limbs, just if I just take trapezius and I take deltoid and pectoralis major, minor, can you see what a traffic jam there would be with so many nerves supplying them? So instead, what happens is in the case of the limbs, these limbs the nerves which have to supply the muscles, they network together. So can you see, for example, two nerves here have joined and formed one kind of nerve. This has gone like this. Then these two have joined and formed a nerve. Then they have networked together. So finally, when we get a nerve like this and we kind of trace it back, this is a single nerve. But can you see it's carrying fibers from 5, 6, 7, 8 and T1. So this is the way the nerve will, these plexus, this network is known as a plexus. And it helps to supply many muscles, prevents a traffic jam. And, all the muscles get their original nerve supply from when they were developing. But now, instead of having a number of nerves supplying them, you only have one nerve which carries fibers from all those same spinal segments. Okay? So that's the purpose of a plexus. So plexus is nothing but a network of nerves which innervates, means supplies muscles in the limbs. And it uses several spinal segments. So you can see, if you had to, suppose the pectoralis major was developing from regions supplied by 5th, 6th and 7th spinal segments, instead of having 3 nerves, 5, 6 and 7, now all 3 nerves joined together and formed one nerve. So one nerve is carrying all of that. Okay? Okay, let's stop here.